The holidays are right around the corner, and Santa may or may not be making a pit stop in Winnipeg. What should the Jets ask for under the proverbial Christmas tree? Let's find out on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andersson Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLogo and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, obviously, the Jets are about to get into some action against San Jose and tomorrow Anaheim. But I wanted to take some time today to talk about Santa's wish list for the Jets. Winnipeg is in a really interesting spot of honestly being able to go almost any direction the team pleases, whether that's to improve through trade, maybe to try playing youth for an internal improvement, a combination of the two, something along those lines. And so for the Jets, I think it's really imperative to figure this out earlier in the season because, once you start getting into the second half, and that's typically where the Jets in previous years sort of crashed out, the Jets have a real opportunity to rewrite that script this year, and I think it would be great if they have a much stronger second half heading into the postseason, right? You have good vibes, you're playing well, you're piecing together your 5v5 game at that point. You're just getting yourselves ready for the postseason and what is to follow. And I think that would be really good for Winnipeg to nail that down this year. And obviously with the Jets, there's probably any number of directions that they could go. But we'll chat about a couple of key needs first and then talk about some players who maybe sit on the achievables list and guys who are pretty far out there and really not realistic, but there could be a way the Jets pull it off with the right trade package. We'll chat about that in just a brief moment, but before we go any further, just wanted to let you know that the college football playoff is finally here, and you don't want to miss a moment of the action. The college football playoff presented by Allstate begins with 4 first-round games, December 20th and 21st on ESPN, ABC, TNT, and Max. Be sure to tune in and, of course, get ready for some of the hottest in college football action. Now, like I said, the Jets have a whole myriad of things that they might be interested in. Maybe they're looking for a top 6 center. Maybe they're looking for a top 4 defender. And I think for the Jets, it's really hard to know what the priority is, right? Do they maybe want another scoring wing, especially on the left side maybe? I think it's hard to really know what is the most prioritized need. I'd say on the wingers front, that's a little further down on my list. I think right now where I'm at, I want a top 6 center and, if possible, maybe a second pairing defender. That's a lot, though. I mean, for a single trade window, that's a pretty fairly hefty ask. And so I think the Jets would probably be better served, at least in their own internal minds, picking one of the two. I'd love to have both. I don't know that that's realistic, but the Jets might be able to swing something if the right deal approaches. And I think for the Jets, if we're looking at what is the single biggest need and what can really turn this team around, it depends on what you think wins championships. Now, for the NHL, the past few years have really started a trend in the direction of offense. And with that in mind, I really think the Jets should go after a big top 6 center who adds not only good skating, but also a great release. I think the finishing for this team, while it is pretty good in some respects, maybe doesn't have the natural talent that feels like some of the top contenders do. And that's where, there might be some rentals out there, some of which we've talked about already, maybe some players that I'm sort of keeping in mind for other potential deals. But for the Jets, this is a year where it could really pay to add a top finishing talent, right? The Jets offense scores a lot already, but we know that the way that they actually create a lot of these goals is primarily on the power play. And so the Jets have got to figure out a way to get the 5v5 game going. The Lowry line can't be your only answer to that. And if that is the case, then, if you're not really willing to break up the top line, you need to bring in somebody else to help the second line. that was going to be the case anyways, even if they didn't like rearrange the top 9 a bit. I feel like it's still maybe a little thin and a little prone to, disaster if even one player gets injured. We're already seeing what happens with an injured Scheifele, who's still playing, but is maybe closer to 85 or 90% than 100%. And already down Ehlers. It's not been easy for the Jets. On defense, I think Winnipeg has actually just made things a little bit harder for themselves than they really need to. There's no getting around the fact that Sandberg is a tremendous loss for this team. But, willingly playing Stanley because he PKs kind of puts you at a disadvantage already. And I think the Jets can honestly do some stuff internally to where you may not need to acquire a top pairing defender immediately. And it also depends on what happens with DeMello. The DeMello situation is, for me, one of the bigger concerns this year. I don't quite know how you patch around it yet, but in the meantime, if you're going to accept that the blue line's probably not going to have like a game-changing acquisition, then look to improve up front. Offense is the bigger focus these days. I think the Jets would be better served, honestly, going for a top 6 center, and it'll help the Jets rebalance their top 9. It might also quietly give Winnipeg another top line to work with, because the real top line for Winnipeg right now, it's just been mediocre. Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde are less than the sum of the parts, and I feel like when you're looking at just how good Connor is versus, maybe some of the up and down play of Scheifele and Velarde, you have to figure out some way to compensate for it. The team doesn't really seem intent on breaking them up. I think that's going to have to change if the Jets really want to have a deep playoff run, but failing that, then at least having another line that you could potentially run almost equally would be sick. And if you bring in like a really big center or maybe even a big winger who can almost do the same work of play driving and creation that a center would, I would not be averse to that idea. So the Jets definitely have a couple of avenues, but I'd swing big for a big scorer up front. And then, if you have extra assets and you think that you can maybe fit in a top 4 defender from somewhere, wouldn't be the worst to try and swing for that. I feel like the Jets would probably go for a forward and then maybe bring in a depth defender. That's kind of been their MO in the past. I'm not guaranteeing this, but it just seems like that is typically how the Jets tend to approach things. And maybe they change it up this time. I don't know. This feels like a year where Winnipeg has any number of directions that they could really go. And because of that, I think it's going to be hard for them to internally prioritize. And I think that they're trying to figure out if Shibberkov, Lambert, perhaps even Salamonson later this year could potentially step into a role heading into the playoffs. Salamonson, I don't really see being that player. He's already going to miss considerable time with this shoulder injury, a few weeks, so he may not really be having enough of a full AHL season to have a really good read on what his NHL stuff would be like. I do think he'll get a game or two later at the end of this year as a reward, but I don't really figure him into the Jets playoff plans. So Winnipeg may be, figuring to bring in a depth defender if they don't feel like Fleury and Coughlin are enough. Heinola obviously swapping in there, Stanley swapping in there. They have lots of options in that respect, but I feel like the Jets maybe have a bigger need if DeMello doesn't turn things around. And that is a pretty real scenario. So, if you can find a way to bring in maybe another like underrated DeMello type, somebody who's maybe underappreciated and undervalued by the league, but could help stabilize the Morrissey pairing, I wouldn't be averse to that. It may not cost you an arm and a leg. The Jets have seemingly done really well with the DeMello trade, the Miller trade. I mean, they just generally don't have to pay a lot for pretty solid defenders. So some stuff to consider there. Or they could try to fix it internally. I don't know. Maybe you just swap Miller and DeMello and see what happens. Could work. I don't know. I wouldn't expect the Jets to do that. I think DeMello is probably seen as the guy for Morrissey, but I don't know, man. The way that he's been playing this year in DeMello's case, it's been a little bit on the rougher side. So the Jets are going to have to really think long and hard about how they want to approach the so-called Santa's wish list. But now it's time to really talk about who could actually fit on this list and who might not really be all that attainable, but could still be a potential target if the Jets want to swing like mega big. We'll chat about the achievables in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, I did want to let you know about our friends and partners at Bilt Rewards. Today's episode is brought to you by Bilt, and if you're a renter, you're going to want to listen up. This is a total game changer. Thanks to Bilt, you can now earn points on rent payments just like you do with groceries or travel. Paying rent right now comes with serious perks, and it's completely free to join. You can earn valuable Bilt points on your rent and everyday spending at no extra cost. You can even redeem points towards flights, hotel stays, and even future rent payments. With over 500 airlines and 700,000 hotels in their program, the possibilities are endless, and you can even access unique experiences that are only available to Bilt members. Start earning points on rent you're already paying by going to joinbilt.com/lockedonnhl. That's joinbilt.com/lockedonnhl to make sure to use our link so they know that we sent you. Don't wait. Start earning rewards today. Also thought you should hear about our friends and partners at SelectQuote. The World Series, the Super Bowl, the Olympics. The world's top athletes get to play in these top-level sporting events thanks to one thing: teamwork. And teamwork can also protect your financial legacy and your family's future. SelectQuote's licensed insurance agents are the perfect teammates when shopping for customized, affordable life insurance. They can find you the right policy to keep your financial legacy safely in your family's end zone. SelectQuote is one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, helping over 2 million customers find over $700 billion in coverage since 1985. And when you're investing so much time to take care of yourself and to be the healthiest, best version of yourself you can be, SelectQuote's exclusive policies are here to reward those efforts. These policies are also a lot more affordable than you think. You could get coverage for up to $1 million for as little as $20 a month. SelectQuote is here to help you, and you can head to selectquote.com, and a licensed insurance agent will call you right away with the right policy for your life and your budget. Get the right life insurance for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Go to selectquote.com/lockedonnhl to get started. That's selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Hey friends, welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andersson, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. We are just chatting a little bit about, some fun stuff for the Jets trade perhaps needs or even their trade deadline run. And you heard me talk about what I think that they should prioritize. We've talked about, maybe a defender, a top four defender. But I think if we're being 100% transparent, the bigger need is at forward. This team up front is good, but it still feels like, when it comes to a top six center or something, the Jets are still lacking. And, a top six center is what most every team is going to be after. Everyone looks for a top scorer like this. And I think for the Jets especially, having had Nemesnikov occupying this role, Lowry's kind of been your shadow 2C at times. It's not really working well. Scheifele is doing okay as your top line center. I wouldn't say it's been amazing this year. The score sheet looks great. The box score, you don't really see too many problems with. But when you look at how, the first line's performing, it does feel like it's imperative to find the Jets somebody who can rebalance this top nine and shake up the entire lineup from the bottom up. And so, I have a couple of tiers, right? And the achievables tier is a list of folks that I think the Jets do have a real shot at getting and can actually afford. And players who are maybe a little more available on the board. Now, one of the biggest names that's been added to this list as of today was Kaapo Kakko. And Chabot, I think, is a really interesting player. He has played at center, although I think predominantly right now he's at right wing. He's a young 23-year-old RFA who I think gets a little bit of an unfair rap in some ways. He does seem to, be a bit disgruntled with the Rangers. He was talking about not being thrilled with some of the benchings recently. He's not happy that he's coming out of the lineup and that there's a feeling that he hasn't really performed up to standard, according to the coaching staff, when his own assessment is that, there are players out there who are going almost every game, and they're not really feeling any of the heat for their lack of defensive prowess, the lack of production, and the generally piss-poor play that the Rangers have been putting out there. It's one of those old versus young things, and Kakko's kind of been at the butt end of it. But I would also say that as a second overall pick, he's not really been the kind of guy that's ever looked like that sort of player, right? And I think Kakko, maybe again, I think that there are some slightly unfair expectations for what his career arc has been like. And I think the Rangers haven't really done a great job of putting him in the best position to succeed. But what is he, right? He's a really intriguing middle six forward with very good skating. And what I've noticed about a lot of the ways that he tends to score goals is that he's often driving towards the net. He's following up on second chance opportunities. He's not afraid to crash the crease. And he's also a very smart player. His sense of space and timing always seems to find him open on the far post for a cross crease pass. He's got a great release. He's a smart shooter. And, he doesn't really play a lot. So the production, I think, is pretty depressed. But if you look under the surface, I think that there's reason to think that he's a legit breakout candidate. I don't know that he's ever going to be second overall good. And in fact, I would probably bet against that for the duration of his career. But if you're thinking about a player who scored 40 points a couple of years ago, I don't think that that's really unreasonable for him to get back to. And given that the Jets often do have some issues recruiting top young talent, if you think that you can maybe get Kakko going again, he is, to me, a really intriguing cheap ad. But the thing is if the Rangers are looking at him like a really expensive prospect and somebody that they don't want to let go for a bargain price, it probably doesn't work out. And the Jets may also want to swing bigger, right? I look at, Brock Nelson as a player I've mentioned before. And if you're talking about achievables, Nelson is a very big target who could be on the move with the Islanders, definitely out of the playoff picture for the most part. And Nelson to me is exactly the kind of net front presence, but also strong skater and playmaker who would be a huge boost. He'd probably be our best overall center at this point. And I think, he could be your shadow 1C if the Jets are perhaps looking to try and shake things up down the middle. He's a 70-point player for the last couple of years. You don't really find many of those available, and he'd be an elite rental. Now, Mikael Granlund feels like the kind of guy the Jets would actually go for. He's been almost a point per game for the Sharks. Granlund at this stage, he's a decent center, but I always look at him more as like a middle six guy. I feel like he always has these streaks where he scores a ton of points for his, bottom feeder team. And then, he gets to another squad. And when he starts getting pushed into a more depth role, a lot of that production seems to go away. Now, maybe that's not the case here, but I feel like I'm just not really in love with it. The defensive side of his game tends to be pretty lacking. He is definitely a good finisher and playmaker and scorer. So I think that there's some value there. I just don't know if I would really want to make that my particular target, right? Another guy that could be of interest in is sort of not necessarily in the Kakko thing, in the Kakko vein, but another guy that I could see being an interesting option is Tommy Novak. And Novak is one of those middle six centers who had a really big offensive explosion the last year or so with the Preds. And he does score at like a reasonable clip. Maybe not crazy, but if you're looking for a player who you think might be able to step into the Nemesnikov spot and actually shine alongside Perfetti and company, he could be an intriguing option. He's got a little bit of term control, I think another year or so on his deal, and his cap hit's very low. With the Preds really spiraling out of control, you could maybe make a pitch for him. And, there could be some longevity in having him around. He's at a reasonable, mid-20s age. His underlying metrics have generally been strong. He, positively pushes play and creates offensive opportunities. I think that there's a legitimately good player there, and maybe the Jets would be interested in bringing somebody like Novak in. I don't know that I would necessarily expect the world of him. He's not going to be a 70 or 80 point guy, but if you're looking for somebody who could be around the 40 to 45 point mark, maybe that's the sort of player that could help boost the Jets. And if you prorate his production, it's, he's doing 40 and 45 points in like 14 minutes a night, which is pretty crazy. That's not too dissimilar from what Perfetti was doing last year with very limited ice time. Maybe you give him more ice time, like 16, 17 minutes, and his production hits 60 points or something. It wouldn't be that unfathomable. So Novak is a really interesting candidate. I don't know that he would be crazy expensive, and maybe he'd want to join the Jets. He's a Minnesota boy, and he could be a really interesting value add if the price is right, sort of in that Niederreiter tier of player. Now, maybe reaching a little more, Mackenzie Weegar could be an option. I put him more in the maybe tier just because I think Uyghur's going to be more expensive. McKenzie would be a huge upgrade for the Jets D, and pretty clearly a guy that you might consider playing alongside either Sandberg or Morrissey to really cement your top four. My guess is he wouldn't necessarily go up there immediately, but I think with DeMello struggling and Pionk, kind of being Neil Pionk, maybe it would be a good option. Morrissey, anchor, or somebody who can keep pace with Sandberg and be really this lockdown pairing. But I don't know that he necessarily fits how the Jets see their blue line. I don't know. And I don't think he would be particularly cheap. But he is a name that always seems to come up whenever folks speculate about the Jets. And in terms of trade partners, I think he is an interesting player. But for me, the other name that does stick out is Alex Tuck. I don't know if Tuck really wants to leave Buffalo, but if you're looking for maybe an older winger who's strong and has that really good net drive with a great shot, and he can kind of bully his way to the front of the net, but has enough skill and finesse to be a really creative playmaker. He to me is very interesting. I think that there's some real upside with him. Not necessarily like a Mark Stone level player, but a guy who's probably maybe a step or two below that, but still a really, really good top six winger. So a guy that I've liked for a long time, and I could certainly see instantly fitting in with Winnipeg. But, again, I kind of put him in that middle tier. He's a harder get. But for me, I would love this year to be a year that the Jets swing big. I know that sounds a little bit overrated, but with Winnipeg kind of being in a position where they can do almost anything, I think that they should really focus on making a big impact acquisition. So that's just my take. But speaking of impact acquisitions, I've got a handful of players who are really on the not happening list unless, something crazy shakes through. And we'll talk about who kind of fits in here and which of these guys I would really, really be interested in just a little bit. But before we go too much further, I wanted to let you know about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. If you're thinking about Ravens versus Steelers, that is probably one of the marquee matchups this weekend. I'm going Ravens. I think that they're finally going to exercise their demons, but maybe you're getting a different hunch in the middle of the game. Well, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you're placing your bets. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's only at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey friends, and welcome back to these closing thoughts in tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We are closing out with some final thoughts on our trade list and maybe some players who are perhaps in the not happening range in terms of actual trade likelihood, but guys who, would still be worth at least investigating, right? These are going to be fairly unsurprising names. You're probably like, yeah, of course, everyone worth their salt would be after these guys. But maybe there's a little bit more inherent risk with a couple of these names. Two of those players that sort of fit this definition for me are Barzal and Cousins. Now, Barzal is interesting from New York because he's had a bit of an up and down past couple of years. You look at his points totals and you always feel that they're a little depressed relative to his skill set. And I think right now he's kind of playing in a third line role due to some recent injury stuff. And the injury has kind of been an issue for him in the past couple of years. He's missed some games off and on. Last year, I think he played like 80 games. So it was one of his first really healthy seasons in some time. But Barzal just feels like a really good top six center who could be, super creative, maybe kind of like your Ehlers down the middle with that great center of gravity, a nasty release, excellent vision, so much playmaking creativity, and he also comes with a lot of term. Now, the term is maybe where I have some reservation, right? I think he's making like $9 million a season, which, with the cap going up here pretty soon, not really an issue to me. But for finding a way to make it fit for the Jets, I don't know if it's really possible. After this year, he's got another 6 if I'm looking at, another 6 under contract, it's a hefty cap hit, but again, with the cap going up, I don't worry about that so much. I do think it would probably hit Winnipeg's internal wage structure, and they may not like that. But if you're looking for a 27-year-old center with great creativity and clearly a player who, in my mind, would actually become your best center on the team, and somebody who I think with the Jets could easily hit 80, 90 points without really blinking, Barzal feels like a pretty interesting bet. I think a lot of the folks are going to look at his last couple of years and think, what is Harrison talking about, right? 51 and 58 and 23, 59 and 73 and 22. And it's been, sort of up and down. He's been around a point per game in some seasons, maybe a little bit over in one year or two, a point per game in others, and then off the pace in other seasons like this year. And it's hard to know at times how much is really him and how much it is just the Islanders kind of being the Islanders. But I feel like he's really good. I think if you get him outside of the Islanders system, he is going to be a monster. And if there's a risk that I think would be an intriguing one, and certainly one that, if the Jets really want to swing crazy big, you could do a lot worse than Barzal. And maybe the Islanders are really looking for a change, and that's where you make like a Lambert plus kind of swap for him. Cousins, on the other hand, he just signed a massive extension. He's making like $7 million a year. And the Sabres are just absolutely reeling. Right now, I think they're actually losing to the Canadians. This after the owner Terry Pegula just gave an impassioned speech or something to the players. Apparently, that really didn't have any impact because they're still losing, and they've really been embarrassing this season. And they're looking for some kind of culture shakeup, a room shakeup, a roster shakeup. I don't even know what you do with this team at this point. Cousins has been underperforming pretty badly this year. Shooting percentage is down, but I don't know if it's necessarily off his usual pace. I mean, he's been somewhere between a 40 and 45 point guy on average from most of these seasons. He had one big 68 point year in 23, but the rest of his years have generally been in the more middle six range. Now, he's also not deployed like a first-line center, so maybe if he comes to the Jets, he'd become that guy. And again, if you prorate the cap hit, considering what it's going to be like with the future cap raise, maybe, it's not going to be that big of a percentage of the final cap, but he does carry some risk that maybe he really is like a middle six performer and not a top six guy. But Cousins is super talented. I think he's maybe just dealing with some confidence issues, a dysfunctional team. And if you get him out of there, it could pay off big dividends. On the D side, if you want to swing big for blue liners, Chabot and Andersson, right? Rasmus and Thomas are both elite skaters, excellent top pairing defenders with incredible puck movement, offensive creation, defensive impact, whatever it is that you want to say about these guys. Both of them are absolutely phenomenal. You will have to pay a fortune for either of them, zero question. And I would basically not hesitate, right? These are the sorts of talents where it's like if you need to put in a Brad Lambert and a Barlow or a Lucius or something in a package, just do it. The quality of play that you're going to get out of these guys is tremendous. Noah Dobson, also a similar tier of defender. Again, I don't really see any of these players moving. They are cornerstone players for their franchises. I don't think something happens unless the teams themselves are looking for a massive, massive shock to the core, something that just shakes everything up. Andersson could be a little more on the block just because he's like, 26, 27 at this point. And, the Flames are looking to rebuild, and Andersson could bring in a really big haul. But again, I think that's a little bit much to say that he's really available. He's 28 now, so, he is getting on the older side. But for the Flames, I mean, he's fantastic. And if you get rid of him, it's going to be really hard to replace his puck-moving ability, his leadership, the offensive production that he brings. Rasmus is fantastic. I love him. But he, I don't think that he's necessarily available. But he would be phenomenal alongside Josh Morrissey. Chabot, again, kind of a similar situation. I think Ottawa would be, in my mind, a little crazy for letting him go, but if they're really intent on trying to change what they feel is ailing them, I could see that. But so far, they have turned things around since they've started getting saves, so I just don't really feel like that's going to be the direction that they go. But hey, Maybe something crazy happens. Maybe there's a shock and, some one of these players somehow become available. But let me know which of these guys, whether they're achievable or not achievable, who are you after, right? Who are your most wanted players? Drop those in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. I thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day, every day. Thanks so much. See you tomorrow. Have a great night. And as always, go Jets go.